The morning sun cast geometric shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria Sterling's corner office, painting sharp lines across the polished concrete floor of the converted warehouse that housed Sterling and Associates architecture. At 34, Victoria had built her firm from a one-woman operation working out of a cramped studio apartment to a prestigious practice with 15 employees and projects spanning 3 states. The industrial chic space in Seattle's Pioneer Square perfectly embodied her aesthetic, raw materials refined into something beautiful and purposeful. Victoria stood before the massive drafting table that dominated her office, her dark hair pulled back in its characteristic low bun, reviewing the final plans for the Meridian Cultural Center. This project would be her masterpiece, a $40 million commission that would establish her as one of the Pacific Northwest's premier architects. After 3 years of development, countless revisions, and more sleepless nights than she cared to count, they were finally ready for the presentation that would seal the deal. "Vic, you need to see this." The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, her business partner and, until recently, her fiancé. They had met in graduate school at the University of Washington, bonded over late nights in the studio and shared dreams of revolutionizing sustainable architecture. When Victoria started her firm, Marcus had joined as a partner, bringing his expertise in structural engineering and his considerable charm with clients. Victoria looked up from the plans, noting the unusual tension in Marcus's voice. He stood in the doorway, his typically immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, holding what appeared to be a manila envelope. His olive-green eyes, which once held warmth when they looked at her, now seemed to avoid direct contact. "What is it?" "If it's about the Meridian presentation, everything's ready. The models are perfect, the renderings are stunning, and—" "It's not about Meridian," Marcus interrupted, stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. The click of the latch seemed unusually loud in the sudden silence. Victoria's instincts, honed by years of managing complex projects and difficult clients, immediately went on alert. In their 7 years together, both professionally and personally, Marcus had never looked at her with such a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Then what?" She set down her pen and turned to face him fully, crossing her arms over her charcoal blazer. Marcus took a deep breath and placed the envelope on her desk. "I've been offered a position with Hammond and Associates in Portland. Head of their Sustainable Design Division. It's an incredible opportunity, Vic. Everything we've been working toward." Victoria stared at the envelope, her mind immediately calculating the implications. Hammond and Associates was their primary competitor in the Pacific Northwest, a 100-person firm with deep pockets and a reputation for aggressive business practices. The envelope bore their distinctive letterhead. "When did this happen?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "They approached me 6 months ago. I didn't take it seriously at first, but then they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Double my current salary, full partnership track, and—" He paused, running a hand through his black hair. "They want me to bring the Meridian project with me." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. 6 months. He had been negotiating with their competition for 6 months while she worked tirelessly on their biggest project, while they planned their wedding, while she trusted him completely with every aspect of her business and personal life. "That's impossible," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she knew it wasn't. "You don't have the rights to Meridian. I'm the lead architect, it's my design, my client relationship." "Actually," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone she'd never heard before, cold, calculated, "if you read the partnership agreement we signed 3 years ago, you'll see that all projects developed during our partnership are joint intellectual property. I have as much claim to Meridian as you do." Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the same sensation she'd experienced during the 2001 Nisqually earthquake that had damaged so many of Seattle's historic buildings. But this wasn't a natural disaster, this was deliberate destruction. "You can't be serious. That project is my life's work. I've put everything into it." And I've been there every step of the way, Marcus said, his voice rising. My structural innovations made your artistic vision possible. My client management kept the project on track when you were lost in your creative process. This isn't just your project, Vic. It never was. The betrayal cut deeper than Victoria had ever imagined possible. This wasn't just about business, it was about everything they had built together, everything she had trusted him with. The man she had planned to marry, the partner she had confided her every professional dream to, was systematically dismantling their shared life. What about us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What about our engagement? Our plans? Marcus looked down at his hands, and for a moment, Victoria saw a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with. But when he looked up again, his expression was resolute. That's over, Vic. It has been for a while, if I'm being honest. We've grown apart, become different people. You've become so focused on your work, so driven, that there's no room for anything else. I need something more. The carefully constructed world Victoria had built, professionally and personally, was crumbling around her, and she realized that Marcus had been planning this demolition for months while she had been blissfully unaware, pouring her heart into both their relationship and their shared business. She walked to the window, looking out at Elliott Bay, where ferries moved steadily across the dark water. Those vessels had been making the same routes for over a century, reliable and constant. She had thought Marcus was like those ferries, dependable, committed to their shared journey. I need you to leave, she said without turning around. Vic, I know this is hard, but we can handle this professionally. There's no reason we can't. Leave. Now. Her voice was steady, but Marcus must have heard the steel beneath the surface because he didn't argue. She heard the door open and close, heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. Only then did she allow herself to fully absorb what had just happened. Her business partner, the man she loved, had spent months plotting against her while she worked toward their shared dreams. Victoria remained at the window for a long time, watching the city move through its rhythms below. Seattle had reinvented itself multiple times, from a logging town to a tech hub, always adapting, always surviving. If the city could transform after devastating setbacks, so could she. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. Victoria's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the manila envelope Marcus had left behind. Inside were photocopies of various documents, the partnership agreement they had signed 3 years earlier, financial projections for the Meridian project, and what appeared to be preliminary contracts with Hammond and Associates. She had signed that partnership agreement during one of the happiest periods of her life. Marcus had proposed during a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands, and they had been giddy with plans for both their wedding and the expansion of their firm. The legal documents had seemed like mere formalities then, a way to formalize what already felt natural and permanent. Now, reading the carefully crafted language with clear eyes, Victoria realized how naive she had been. The agreement was heavily weighted in Marcus's favor, giving him equal rights to all intellectual property developed during their partnership, despite the fact that she owned the firm and had been the driving creative force behind their major projects. She reached for her phone and dialed her lawyer, David Reeves, who had helped her incorporate the business 5 years earlier. Victoria, good morning. How are the wedding plans coming along? The innocent question hit her like a slap. She had called David just 2 weeks earlier to discuss updating her will to include Marcus as a beneficiary. David, I need to see you today. It's urgent. Marcus and there's been a development. Of course. Can you be here in an hour? David Reeves operated out of a traditional law office in Columbia Center, Seattle's tallest building. His practice specialized in intellectual property and business law, and he had guided Victoria through the early challenges of building her firm. In his late 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, David had become something of a father figure to Victoria, whose own parents had died in a car accident when she was 25. Victoria spread the documents across David's mahogany conference table, her hand steadier now that she was taking action. "Tell me the worst-case scenario," she said after explaining the situation. David studied the documents carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. His expression grew more serious as he read. "I'm afraid Marcus is correct about the intellectual property clause," he said finally. "This agreement gives him substantial rights to any project developed during your partnership. However," he continued, noting Victoria's expression, "there are several factors working in your favor." He turned to a fresh page in his legal pad. "First, you maintain controlling interest in the firm itself. He can't force you to sell or transfer ownership. Second, while he has rights to the intellectual property, you have the client relationship. The Meridian Cultural Foundation contracted with Sterling and Associates, specifically requesting you as the lead architect. But can he take the project with him? It's complicated. He could potentially claim joint ownership of the design and attempt to license it to Hammond and Associates. However, that would require either your agreement or a court order. More importantly, he would be breaching his fiduciary duty to Sterling and Associates by using proprietary information to benefit a competitor." Victoria felt a small spark of hope. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means we can fight him. But I need to ask you something difficult, Victoria. Did you suspect anything? Any unusual behavior, unexplained absences, meetings he didn't tell you about?" Victoria thought back over the past 6 months. Marcus had been traveling more frequently, claiming to be developing new client relationships. He had been spending more time on his phone, often stepping out of the office to take calls. There had been nights when he worked late at the office, returning to their shared apartment in Capitol Hill well after midnight. "There were signs," she admitted. "I was so focused on Meridian that I didn't pay attention. I trusted him completely. That trust may have been misplaced, but it doesn't make you naive. It makes you human. Now, we need to move quickly. I'm going to file an injunction to prevent him from sharing any proprietary information with Hammond and Associates. We'll also need to examine your firm's computer systems, phone records, anything that might show how long he's been planning this." "What about the engagement? Our personal relationship?" David's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I know how much Marcus meant to you. But from a legal perspective, the fact that you weren't married protects you. Your personal assets remain separate, and Washington's community property laws don't apply." As Victoria left David's office, she felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what lay ahead. The legal battle would be expensive and time-consuming, but the emotional toll might be even greater. She would have to relive the betrayal repeatedly, in depositions and court filings and strategy meetings. But as she walked through downtown Seattle, past the construction sites and renovated buildings that represented the city's constant evolution, Victoria felt something else emerging alongside the pain and anger: determination. Marcus had underestimated her. He had assumed that she would be too devastated to fight, that she would accept his version of events and let him walk away with half of everything she had built. He was wrong. Victoria Sterling had designed buildings that could withstand earthquakes and windstorms. She would find a way to withstand this too. Victoria's first priority was damage control. She arrived at the office early the next morning to find that Marcus had already cleared out his desk and taken several files with him. The absence of his presence in the space felt like a missing wall, structurally significant and immediately noticeable. She gathered her team in the main conference room, a space she had designed to encourage collaboration with its circular table and natural light. Now it would serve a different purpose entirely. Her 15 employees filed in with their usual morning coffee and casual chatter, but the atmosphere shifted when they saw Victoria's expression. Sarah Kim, her lead project manager, was the first to notice the empty space where Marcus's desk had been. "Where's Marcus?" Sarah asked, her dark eyes scanning the room. Victoria had rehearsed this moment during her sleepless night, but facing her team, people who had worked closely with Marcus for years, made it real in a way that even the legal documents hadn't. "Marcus has decided to leave Sterling and Associates to pursue other opportunities," she said, keeping her voice steady. "This is effective immediately." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. James Rodriguez, their talented young designer, raised his hand. "What does this mean for our current projects?" "For Meridian? All current projects will continue as planned. I want to assure you that this firm's financial stability and project commitments remain unchanged. However, we will need to restructure some of our workflows and responsibilities." Elena Vasquez, the office manager who had been with Victoria since the firm's early days, spoke up. "Victoria, if you need us to take on additional responsibilities, we're here for you. This team is solid." The support from her employees touched Victoria more than she had expected. These people had chosen to work for Sterling and Associates because they believed in her vision, her leadership. Marcus's departure wouldn't change that. "Thank you, Elena. I'll be meeting with each of you individually over the next few days to discuss how we'll redistribute Marcus's responsibilities and move forward. In the meantime, please keep this information confidential until we can develop an appropriate communication strategy for our clients." After the meeting, Victoria retreated to her office and began the systematic process of securing the firm's intellectual property. David had recommended a digital forensics expert, and Victoria wanted to understand exactly what information Marcus might have taken with him. Her phone rang as she was reviewing access logs from their shared server. "Victoria Sterling? This is Patricia Hammond from Hammond and Associates." Victoria's grip tightened on the phone. Patricia Hammond was the founding partner of their competitor firm, known for her ruthless business tactics and aggressive recruitment of talent. "Ms. Hammond. I assume you're calling about Marcus Chen." "Indeed. I wanted to reach out personally to see if we might discuss a transition arrangement that would be beneficial for both our firms. Marcus has brought some fascinating projects to our attention, and I believe there could be opportunities for collaboration." The audacity was breathtaking. Patricia Hammond was calling to negotiate for stolen intellectual property as if it were a normal business transaction. "Ms. Hammond, any projects Marcus might have discussed with you are proprietary to Sterling and Associates. I would strongly advise you to consult with your legal counsel before proceeding with any arrangements based on information he may have provided." There was a brief pause. "Victoria, I understand you're upset about Marcus's departure, but business is business. Talent moves in our industry, and intellectual property follows talent. I'm sure we can reach an amicable arrangement. The only arrangement I'm interested in is having Marcus return any proprietary information he may have taken." "Good day, Ms. Hammond." Victoria hung up the phone, her hands shaking with anger. The call confirmed her worst fears. Marcus hadn't just left her personally and professionally, he had actively betrayed her trust by sharing confidential information with her competitors. She immediately called David to report the conversation. "We need that injunction as soon as possible," she told him. "And I want to explore every legal avenue available to us." The afternoon brought another unwelcome surprise. Thomas Meridian, the chairman of the Meridian Cultural Foundation and their most important client, called to request an emergency meeting. "Victoria, I've been hearing some concerning rumors about changes at your firm. I think we should discuss the status of our project." Victoria agreed to meet him that evening at his penthouse office overlooking Puget Sound. Thomas Meridian was old Seattle money, a philanthropist whose family had made their fortune in timber and shipping. In his 70s now, with white hair and sharp blue eyes, he commanded respect throughout the city's cultural and business communities. "Sit down, Victoria. Would you like some wine?" I have an excellent Walla Walla vintage. Thank you, but I'll stick to coffee. Thomas poured himself a glass of wine and settled into a leather chair across from her. The wall behind him featured an impressive collection of Pacific Northwest art, including several pieces by renowned glass artist Dale Chihuly. I received a call today from Patricia Hammond, he said without preamble. She suggested that there might be some instability at your firm, that my project might be better served by a larger, more established practice. Victoria felt her carefully maintained composure slipping. Mr. Meridian, I can assure you that Sterling and Associates is fully capable of delivering on our commitments. The changes in our personnel don't affect our ability to complete your project. Patricia also mentioned that Marcus Chen, who I understood to be your partner and co-designer on this project, has joined her firm. She suggested that the intellectual property for my cultural center might be in question. This was Marcus's strategy, Victoria realized. He couldn't simply steal the project outright, but he could create enough doubt about its ownership to force a settlement or, even better, convince the client to move the project to Hammond and Associates. Mr. Meridian, Marcus was not the co-designer of your cultural center. He provided structural engineering consultation, but the design concept, the artistic vision, and the client relationship have always been mine. I have documentation of every stage of the design process, from our initial meetings through the current plans. Thomas studied her over his wine glass. I've known you for 3 years, Victoria. Your passion for this project has been evident from the beginning. But I have to consider what's best for the foundation. This cultural center represents a $40 million investment and will serve our community for generations. I can't afford to have it caught up in legal disputes or professional conflicts. Then let me prove to you that those concerns are unfounded. Give me 1 week to provide you with complete documentation of the project's development, including Marcus's actual contributions versus mine. I'll also provide you with references from every other client we've served, demonstrating our firm's stability and reliability. Thomas set down his wine glass and leaned forward. Victoria, I like you. I've always believed in your vision for this project. But I'm going to be honest, Patricia Hammond runs a sophisticated operation. She has resources that you don't, backup systems that you don't, and a track record of delivering large-scale projects that, frankly, you haven't established yet. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Sterling and Associates had grown rapidly, but they were still a boutique firm competing against established corporate practices. What you're describing sounds like scale, not quality, Victoria said. The Meridian Cultural Center isn't just another commercial project. It's a work of art, a space that will inspire and elevate everyone who enters it. That kind of vision doesn't come from corporate committees or standardized processes. It comes from passion, from personal investment, from treating each project as if it were the most important work of your career. I believe that, Victoria. But belief doesn't guarantee results. Then let me make you a guarantee. If I don't deliver the most extraordinary cultural center you've ever imagined, on time and within budget, I'll resign from the project and recommend another firm to complete it. But if I do deliver, and I will, I want you to write a public recommendation that establishes Sterling and Associates as Seattle's premier architectural firm. Thomas smiled for the first time during their meeting. You're betting everything on this project. I already was, Mr. Meridian. The only difference now is that you know it. The digital forensics report arrived on Victoria's desk 3 days later, and its contents were even worse than she had feared. Marcus had been systematically copying files for 8 months, not 6. The evidence showed regular transfers of project files, client lists, financial data, and proprietary design software to external drives. He had essentially been building a complete replica of Sterling and Associates' intellectual property while pretending to be a loyal partner. Victoria sat in David's office, reviewing the forensics report alongside the preliminary injunction documents he had prepared. This is comprehensive evidence of corporate espionage, David said, his usual calm demeanor replaced by barely contained anger. Marcus wasn't just leaving to join a competitor, he was stealing everything you've built to give them a competitive advantage. Can we stop him? We can try. The injunction should prevent him from using any of this information immediately. But Victoria, you need to understand that this is going to be a long, expensive fight. Hammond and Associates will bring significant resources to bear, and they'll try to drag this out to exhaust your finances and energy. What are my alternatives? Let them steal everything I've worked for? Of course not. But I want you to go into this with clear expectations. This kind of litigation can take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It will consume your time and attention when you should be focused on running your business. Victoria thought about Thomas Meridian's words about Hammond and Associates' superior resources. Marcus and Patricia Hammond were counting on her being overwhelmed by the legal complexity, hoping she would settle for a fraction of what she deserved rather than fight. David, what if we don't just play defense? What if we go on the offensive? What do you mean? Marcus violated his fiduciary duty to Sterling and Associates. He breached his contract, stole proprietary information, and conspired with our competitors. Instead of just trying to prevent him from using our intellectual property, what if we sue him and Hammond and Associates for damages? David leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. It's risky. It would require proving not just that he took the information, but that Hammond and Associates knowingly participated in the theft. That's a higher bar to clear. But if we can prove it, what happens? Potentially significant financial damages, return of all stolen property, and an injunction that prevents Hammond and Associates from competing for certain types of projects for a specified period. It would be a complete victory, but it's also the kind of high-stakes litigation that could bankrupt me if we lose. Exactly. Victoria stood and walked to David's window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The Space Needle rose in the distance, an icon of the city's ambitious spirit during the 1962 World's Fair. That structure had been considered impossible by many engineers at the time, but visionary architects and builders had made it a reality. I need to talk to someone, she said. Can you give me 24 hours before we file anything? That evening, Victoria drove to Whidbey Island, where her mentor, Professor Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Marcus, lived in retirement. Elizabeth had been the head of the University of Washington's architecture program when Victoria was a graduate student, and she had remained a trusted advisor throughout Victoria's career. The ferry ride across Puget Sound gave Victoria time to think. The evening light painted the water and mountains in shades of gold and purple, the kind of natural beauty that had drawn her to the Pacific Northwest in the first place. Whatever happened with the legal battles ahead, she didn't want to lose sight of why she had become an architect, to create spaces that enhanced people's lives and celebrated the stunning environment around them. Elizabeth's house was a perfect example of sustainable residential architecture, tucked into a hillside with sweeping views of the Sound. Solar panels and a green roof made it nearly energy neutral, while the interior spaces flowed seamlessly into outdoor terraces and gardens. Victoria, darling, you look terrible, Elizabeth said as she opened the door. In her mid-60s, with silver hair and keen brown eyes, Elizabeth had never been one to sugarcoat her observations. I feel terrible. Can we walk while we talk? They strolled through Elizabeth's garden as Victoria explained the situation. Elizabeth listened without interruption, occasionally pausing to deadhead roses or adjust a plant stake. So, Elizabeth said when Victoria had finished, your question isn't really about legal strategy. It's about whether you're willing to risk everything to fight for what you believe is right. How did you know? Because I've been where you are, though under different circumstances. When I was about your age, I designed a revolutionary sustainable housing complex. My male colleagues claimed credit for the innovations and tried to push me out of the profession entirely. I had to decide whether to accept a diminished role or fight for recognition of my work. What did you do? I fought. It cost me years of my career, relationships, financial security. But I won, and more importantly, I established a precedent that helped other women in architecture who came after me. They had reached a bench overlooking the water, where they sat as the last light faded from the sky. But Victoria, I need to tell you something else. Fighting that battle, even though I won, changed me. I became harder, more suspicious, less willing to trust. Those aren't necessarily negative changes, but they are permanent ones. You'll never be the same person you were before this betrayal. I don't want to be the same person. That person was naive enough to be betrayed by someone she loved. Elizabeth smiled. Good. Then you're ready to fight. But you'll need allies, people you can trust completely. Legal battles aren't won by lawyers alone, they're won by building networks of support and strategic partnerships. What kind of allies? Other architects who've been targeted by Hammond and Associates. Clients who value integrity over size. Industry organizations that are concerned about ethical practices. And most importantly, your own team, the people who chose to work for you because they believe in your vision. As Victoria drove back to Seattle on the late ferry, she felt a clarity she hadn't experienced since Marcus's betrayal. Elizabeth was right, she would never be the same person again. But that wasn't necessarily a loss. The naive trust that had made her vulnerable could be replaced by informed judgment. The single-minded focus on creative work could expand to include strategic thinking about business and relationships. She pulled out her phone and called David. "We're going on the offensive," she said. "File the lawsuit against Marcus and Hammond and Associates. We're going to prove that they stole our intellectual property and conspired to damage our business." "And David? I want to make this a public case. If we're going to fight, let's fight in a way that sends a message to the entire industry about the consequences of betrayal." Victoria's declaration of war against Hammond and Associates sent ripples throughout Seattle's tight-knit architectural community. Within a week of filing the lawsuit, she received calls from colleagues, competitors, and industry leaders who had been watching the situation with interest. The most significant call came from Jonathan Pierce, a senior partner at Pierce, Anderson & Lew, one of the region's most respected firms. Victoria had always admired their work, thoughtful, sustainable designs that managed to be both commercially successful and architecturally significant. "Victoria, I've been following your situation with great interest," Jonathan said when she took his call. "I wonder if we might have coffee to discuss some mutual interests." They met at Victrola on Capitol Hill, a neighborhood coffee shop that had become a gathering place for Seattle's creative community. Jonathan arrived first, a distinguished man in his late 40s with graying temples and the kind of understated elegance that spoke to both artistic sensibility and business acumen. "I'll be direct," he said after they had ordered. "Patricia Hammond has been trying to poach our talent for years, using increasingly aggressive tactics. We've lost 3 junior associates in the past 18 months, each time with proprietary information disappearing shortly before their departure." Victoria felt a surge of validation. "Did you take legal action?" "We considered it, but never had the kind of concrete evidence you seem to have gathered. Each case individually might have been explained as coincidence, but the pattern is clear. Hammond and Associates systematically targets smaller firms, steals their intellectual property, and uses their own resources to outcompete the original creators." "Why are you telling me this?" Jonathan smiled. "Because you're the first person to fight back in a way that might actually work. Your case is well documented, high profile enough to attract attention, and involves a clear instance of corporate espionage. If you win, it establishes a legal precedent that protects all of us. And if I lose? Then we all learn to be more careful about our partnerships and employment agreements." Victoria studied Jonathan's face, looking for hidden motivations. "What do you want from me?" Support. Financial backing for your legal fees, connections to other firms who've been victimized by similar tactics, and most importantly, documentation of our own experiences that might be relevant to your case. The offer was tempting, but Victoria had learned to be suspicious of partnerships. What do you get in return? If you win, Hammond and Associates faces significant financial damages and possibly criminal charges for conspiracy. That levels the playing field for everyone else. Plus, he paused to sip his coffee, if Sterling and Associates emerges from this stronger and more established, there might be opportunities for collaboration on larger projects that neither of our firms could handle alone. Victoria felt the chess pieces of a larger strategy beginning to align. How many other firms have been affected? At least 6 that I know of personally. Probably more who haven't spoken publicly about it. Would they be willing to testify or provide documentation? If they believed it would stop Hammond and Associates from targeting them in the future? Absolutely. That afternoon, Victoria called an emergency meeting with David to discuss Jonathan's proposal. This could change everything, David said, reviewing the list of firms Jonathan had provided. Instead of a single case of employee theft, we could be looking at a pattern of racketeering and conspiracy that involves multiple victims over several years. What does that mean in practical terms? Potentially criminal charges under federal RICO statutes, not just civil damages. Prison time for the perpetrators, not just financial penalties. And most importantly for you, it means we're not fighting alone. Victoria felt a surge of hope mixed with trepidation. The stakes were getting higher, but so were the potential rewards. There's something else, David continued. I've been doing some research on Hammond and Associates' financial situation. They've been growing very aggressively over the past 3 years, taking on debt to fund expansion and recruitment. If we can tie up their assets with injunctions and force them to defend against multiple lawsuits simultaneously, they might not have the resources for a prolonged fight. You're talking about financial warfare. I'm talking about using their own aggressive tactics against them. They've been counting on smaller firms being too intimidated or under-resourced to fight back. But if we coordinate with other victims, we can turn their size and growth into vulnerabilities. Victoria thought about Elizabeth's advice regarding building alliances. This was exactly what her mentor had meant, turning a personal betrayal into an industry-wide battle for ethical business practices. Set up a meeting with the other firms. I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with and what kind of coalition we can build. The meeting took place the following Saturday at Pierce, Anderson and Lou's conference room, a space with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. 6 firms were represented, ranging from small boutique practices to mid-sized companies with national reputations. Victoria listened as each firm's representative described their experiences with Hammond and Associates. The pattern was remarkably consistent: targeted recruitment of key employees, mysterious disappearance of proprietary information, and subsequent loss of clients to Hammond and Associates who seemed to have inside knowledge of their business strategies and pricing. The most frustrating part, said Maria Santos from Santos Architecture, is that we couldn't prove anything. Each incident looked innocent in isolation, just normal employee turnover in a competitive industry. But taken together, added Robert Kim from Kim and Associates, it's clear that Hammond and Associates has built their recent growth on systematic theft of intellectual property from smaller firms. David addressed the group. What we're discussing here is the formation of a plaintiffs' coalition. Each of your firms would file separate lawsuits, but we'd coordinate our legal strategies and share resources. The combined effect would be much greater than the sum of individual cases. Victoria felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. These firms were looking to her case as the catalyst for their own fights for justice, and she was asking them to risk their own resources and reputations in a legal battle with an uncertain outcome. I need to be honest with all of you, she said. This isn't going to be easy or quick. Hammond and Associates will fight viciously, and they'll try to drag this out until we're all exhausted and broke. If we do this, we need to be prepared for a war, not a battle. Jonathan Pierce spoke up. Victoria, some of us have been waiting years for an opportunity like this. Your case with Marcus provides the clear documentation and high-profile visibility we need to make this work. But more than that, you've shown the courage to fight when others might have accepted defeat. We're ready to follow your lead. As Victoria looked around the conference table at the faces of her fellow architects, she realized that Marcus's betrayal had inadvertently positioned her for something much larger than recovering her stolen intellectual property. She was potentially leading an industry-wide effort to establish ethical standards and legal precedents that would protect architectural firms for decades to come. Then let's do this, she said. Let's show Hammond and Associates and anyone else who thinks they can succeed by stealing from smaller firms that there are consequences for betrayal. The coalition of architectural firms moved quickly once they committed to legal action. Within 2 weeks, 6 separate lawsuits had been filed against Hammond and Associates, each one meticulously documented and supported by digital forensics evidence. The Seattle legal community took notice immediately. Victoria's case remained the flagship litigation, both because of the strength of her evidence and the high-profile nature of the Meridian Cultural Center project. But the coordinated filing of multiple lawsuits created a media sensation that none of them could have achieved individually. The Seattle Times ran a front-page article titled "Architectural Firms Accuse Hammond and Associates of Systematic Corporate Espionage." The story detailed the pattern of employee poaching and intellectual property theft, and it included quotes from several industry leaders expressing concern about ethical practices in the architectural community. Victoria read the article while sitting in her office early on a Tuesday morning, coffee growing cold as she absorbed the implications of seeing her private betrayal become public news. Her phone had been ringing constantly since the story broke, with calls from reporters, clients, colleagues, and competitors. Victoria? Sarah Kim appeared in her doorway, holding a stack of phone messages. Channel 4 News wants to interview you for their evening broadcast. The American Institute of Architects is asking you to speak at their ethics committee meeting next month. And? She paused. Thomas Meridian called. He wants to see you this afternoon. Victoria felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. The Meridian project remained the prize that everyone was fighting over, and Thomas's reaction to the media attention could determine whether all of this legal strategy was worthwhile. She arrived at Thomas Meridian's penthouse office to find him reading the Seattle Times article, his expression unreadable. The afternoon light streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows cast dramatic shadows across the room, creating the kind of architectural drama that Victoria usually appreciated. Today, she was too nervous to notice. Sit down, Victoria. This is quite a story. Thomas folded the newspaper and set it aside. I've also received a call from Patricia Hammond, asking me to reconsider the stability of our partnership with Sterling and Associates. Victoria's heart sank. This was exactly what she had feared, that the legal battle would create so much uncertainty that clients would flee to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Mr. Meridian, I understand your concerns, but... Let me finish. Thomas held up a hand. Patricia's call was instructive, but not in the way she intended. She spent 15 minutes trying to convince me that you were an unstable business partner who would inevitably lose this legal battle. But what struck me was how much she knew about our project, details that she could only have learned from someone with intimate knowledge of our planning process. Victoria felt a surge of hope. Marcus shared confidential information about your project. Extensively. Patricia knew about our budget discussions, our timeline concerns, even our internal debates about sustainable building materials. Information that was never shared with anyone outside Sterling and Associates. What does this mean for our project? Thomas smiled for the first time since Victoria had arrived. It means you were right about the intellectual property theft, and it means Patricia Hammond just provided evidence for your lawsuit. More importantly, it confirmed my instinct that you're fighting for principles, not just profit. Victoria felt tears of relief threatening to surface, but she maintained her professional composure. There's something else, Thomas continued. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the difference between corporate architecture and visionary design. This legal battle, difficult as it is, demonstrates exactly the kind of principled leadership that I want associated with our cultural center. I appreciate your confidence, Mr. Meridian, but I have to ask, are you prepared for the media attention and potential complications that might come with supporting Sterling and Associates during this litigation? Victoria, my family has been building institutions in this city for 4 generations. We didn't get where we are by avoiding difficult decisions or backing down from fights when we believed we were right. If anything, this situation has reinforced my commitment to working with you. As Victoria left Thomas's office, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The Meridian project was secure, which meant Sterling and Associates would have the financial stability to survive the legal battle ahead. Her next stop was a strategy meeting with David and the legal team representing the coalition of firms. They had rented a conference room at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, choosing neutral ground where they could work without interruption. The good news, David reported to the assembled group, is that Hammond and Associates is starting to show signs of strain. They've hired 3 different law firms to handle the various cases, which suggests they're struggling to coordinate their defense strategy. Jonathan Pierce leaned forward. What about the financial pressure? Are the injunctions affecting their ability to operate? Significantly, replied David. We've frozen approximately $12 million in assets pending resolution of the intellectual property claims. They're still operating, but they've had to delay several major projects and lay off about 20 employees. Victoria felt a complex mix of satisfaction and guilt. She hadn't wanted innocent employees to lose their jobs, but the pressure was clearly having an effect on Hammond and Associates' ability to function. There's more, David continued. We've discovered that Marcus wasn't the only employee stealing intellectual property. Our investigation has identified at least 3 other former employees of coalition firms who took proprietary information with them to Hammond and Associates. This is looking more and more like a systematic corporate strategy rather than individual instances of employee disloyalty. Maria Santos spoke up. What does that mean for our cases? It means we can potentially pursue criminal charges under federal racketeering statutes. If we can prove that Hammond and Associates operated as a criminal enterprise specifically designed to steal intellectual property, the penalties become much more severe. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were no longer talking about civil lawsuits, they were potentially building a criminal case that could result in prison sentences for the perpetrators. I need to ask everyone here, Victoria said, are we prepared for that level of escalation? Criminal charges mean federal prosecutors, FBI investigations, and media attention that will make the current coverage look minor. Robert Kim nodded thoughtfully. At some point, unethical behavior becomes criminal behavior. If Hammond and Associates built their business on systematic theft, they should face criminal consequences. I agree, said Jonathan. But Victoria, you need to understand that this puts you at the center of a federal investigation. Your personal and professional life will be scrutinized intensively. Are you prepared for that? Victoria thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, focused on her creative work, trusting in her personal relationships, naive about the darker aspects of business competition. That woman would have been terrified by the prospect of federal scrutiny and criminal investigations. But she wasn't that woman anymore. I'm prepared, she said. Marcus and Patricia Hammond made this personal when they decided to steal my life's work. If they've been doing the same thing to other firms, then this is bigger than any of our individual cases. We have a responsibility to stop them. As the meeting concluded, David pulled Victoria aside. There's one more thing you should know. The FBI has already been investigating Hammond and Associates for potential bid rigging and conspiracy charges related to several large municipal projects. Our evidence could be the missing piece they need to build a comprehensive case. Victoria felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on her shoulders. She was no longer just fighting for her own firm, she was potentially providing the key evidence in a federal investigation that could reshape ethical standards throughout the architectural industry. David, what happens if we're wrong? What if the evidence doesn't support criminal charges? Then we continue with the civil cases and hope for significant financial damages. But Victoria, based on what we've discovered so far, I don't think we're wrong. I think we're dealing with the kind of systematic corporate fraud that prosecutors dream about: clear evidence, multiple victims, and a pattern of behavior that demonstrates intent. That evening, Victoria sat in her apartment overlooking Capitol Hill, reviewing the timeline of events that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been planning a wedding and celebrating the biggest project of her career. Now she was leading a coalition of firms in a legal battle that could result in criminal charges against her former fiancé and business partner. The transformation was remarkable, but it hadn't happened overnight. Each revelation, each betrayal, each strategic decision had built upon the previous ones, creating a momentum that was now carrying her toward a confrontation that would determine not just her own future, but potentially the ethical standards of her entire profession. Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and stood at her window, looking out at the city lights sparkling across the hills of Seattle. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably strategizing with Patricia Hammond about how to respond to the latest legal developments. They had assumed that stealing her intellectual property would be easy, that she would be too heartbroken or overwhelmed to fight back effectively. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed once the FBI became involved. Victoria found herself sitting across from Special Agent Jennifer Walsh in a sterile conference room at the federal building in downtown Seattle, surrounded by boxes of evidence that had been seized from Hammond and Associates offices. Agent Walsh was a woman in her early 40s with short brown hair and intense green eyes that missed nothing. She had built her career prosecuting white-collar crime, and she approached the Hammond and Associates case with the methodical precision of someone who understood that complex financial crimes were won or lost on documentation. Ms. Sterling, I want to walk through the timeline of your relationship with Marcus Chin one more time, Agent Walsh said, consulting a thick file folder. Our investigation suggests that his recruitment by Hammond and Associates began much earlier than you initially suspected. Victoria had been through this story dozens of times with lawyers, reporters, and investigators, but each telling revealed new details that she had overlooked in the emotional aftermath of Marcus's betrayal. When we examined his financial records, Agent Walsh continued, we found evidence that Marcus received payments from Hammond and Associates dating back 14 months, not the 6 months he claimed. The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. 14 months ago, she and Marcus had been at their happiest, planning their engagement, celebrating the initial Meridian contract, talking about expanding Sterling and Associates into new markets. While she had been dreaming about their future together, he had already been planning her destruction. What kind of payments? Victoria managed to ask. Consulting fees, initially. Small amounts that could be explained as legitimate architectural consulting. But the amounts increased significantly after he began providing proprietary information from Sterling and Associates. Agent Walsh slid several bank statements across the table. The evidence was undeniable, regular deposits from Hammond and Associates that corresponded exactly with major developments in Victoria's projects. We believe Marcus was essentially working as a corporate spy, Agent Walsh explained. His job was to monitor Sterling and Associates' client development, bid strategies, and design innovations, then report back to Hammond and Associates so they could undercut your proposals or steal your ideas. Victoria stared at the bank statements, trying to reconcile this evidence with her memories of Marcus during that period. He had been affectionate, supportive, seemingly committed to their shared future. How had he managed to maintain such a convincing facade while systematically betraying everything they had built together? "There's more," Agent Walsh said. "We found similar arrangements with employees from 4 other firms in your coalition. Hammond and Associates has been running what amounts to an industrial espionage network throughout the Pacific Northwest architectural community." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Victoria had assumed that Marcus's betrayal was personal, driven by ambition or dissatisfaction with their relationship. But it was actually part of a much larger criminal enterprise designed to destroy smaller architectural firms and concentrate market power in Hammond and Associates' hands. "What happens next?" Victoria asked. "We're preparing federal charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO charges carry severe penalties, up to 20 years in prison and forfeiture of all assets derived from the criminal enterprise." "And Marcus?" "He's looking at conspiracy charges, theft of trade secrets, and wire fraud. If convicted on all counts, he could face 15 to 20 years in federal prison." Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that Marcus would face serious consequences for his betrayal, but also sadness for the destruction of someone she had once loved deeply. The man she had planned to marry would likely spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. "Agent Walsh, I need to ask, what does this mean for our civil lawsuits?" "The criminal case takes precedence, but it actually strengthens your civil claims significantly. If we can prove criminal conspiracy, it makes your claims for damages much easier to establish. You could potentially recover not just your actual losses, but punitive damages that reflect the malicious nature of the conspiracy." As Victoria left the federal building, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had uncovered. What had begun as a personal betrayal had evolved into a federal racketeering case that could reshape business practices throughout her industry. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Kim: "Emergency at the office. Need you here ASAP." Victoria arrived at Sterling and Associates to find her entire team gathered in the conference room, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Sarah stood at the front of the room with a stack of documents and what appeared to be several contracts. "We've received inquiries from 12 potential clients in the past week," Sarah announced. "Word about the Hammond and Associates investigation has spread throughout the architectural community, and firms that were previously too intimidated to work with smaller practices are suddenly very interested in Sterling and Associates." Victoria scanned the list of potential clients Sarah handed her. They included several major developers, 2 university projects, and a municipal contract that would have been beyond Sterling and Associates' reach just a few months earlier. "This is incredible," Victoria said, "but can we handle this volume of work?" "We're still operating with reduced staff after Marcus's departure." Elena Vasquez spoke up. "That's the other news. We've received resumes from 15 architects who want to join Sterling and Associates. Some of them are currently working for large corporate firms, but they want to be part of a practice that stands for ethical business practices." Victoria realized that the public attention surrounding their legal battle had created an unexpected recruitment opportunity. Instead of being damaged by the controversy, Sterling and Associates was actually attracting top talent who admired their willingness to fight for principle over profit. "There's more," said James Rodriguez, grinning broadly. "The American Institute of Architects has asked you to keynote their National Ethics Conference next month. The Pacific Northwest chapter wants to create an award for ethical business practices named after Sterling and Associates." Victoria sat down heavily in her chair, overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of her firm's reputation. 6 months ago, Sterling and Associates had been a respected but relatively unknown boutique practice. Now they were becoming a symbol of integrity in an industry that had been plagued by questions about ethical standards. "This is all wonderful," she said, "but we need to be careful not to let success distract us from the legal battles we're still fighting." Hammond and Associates hasn't surrendered, and they'll undoubtedly try to use our growing profile against us somehow. As if summoned by her words, David Reeves called her cell phone. Victoria, we need to meet immediately. Hammond and Associates has filed a countersuit claiming that you and the coalition firms conspired to damage their business through false accusations and media manipulation. The audacity was breathtaking, but Victoria wasn't surprised. Patricia Hammond had built her career on aggressive tactics, and she wasn't going to surrender without trying every possible strategy to shift blame away from her firm. What are they claiming? Victoria asked. Defamation, intentional interference with business relationships, and conspiracy to restrain trade. They're asking for $50 million in damages and an injunction that would prevent any of the coalition firms from pursuing federal contracts for 5 years. Victoria felt her moment of satisfaction evaporate. Hammond and Associates was trying to use the legal system to punish their victims, turning their own criminal behavior into an attack on the firms they had victimized. Can they do that? They can try. It's a desperate move, but it complicates our strategy significantly. We'll now be fighting both offensive and defensive battles simultaneously. As Victoria hung up the phone, she realized that the war was far from over. If anything, it was escalating into a level of complexity that would test every lesson she had learned about strategy, leadership, and resilience. But as she looked around the conference room at her team, people who had chosen to stand with her through the most difficult period of her professional life, Victoria felt confident that Sterling and Associates would emerge stronger from whatever battles lay ahead. The woman who had been betrayed by her business partner and fiancé was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. The countersuit from Hammond and Associates created exactly the kind of media spectacle that Patricia Hammond had been hoping for. Within days of the filing, business journals and architectural publications were running stories questioning whether the coalition of firms had gone too far in their attack on a respected competitor. Victoria found herself defending not just her firm's actions, but the entire concept of holding corporations accountable for unethical behavior. The narrative was shifting from small firms fight back against corporate theft to legal warfare threatens industry stability. She was preparing for a television interview when her assistant announced an unexpected visitor. Victoria Sterling? I'm Rebecca Torres from the Washington State Attorney General's office. The woman in Victoria's doorway was young, perhaps early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of intense focus that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. Ms. Torres, I wasn't expecting anyone from the Attorney General's office. We've been monitoring the Hammond and Associates situation with great interest. May I come in? Victoria gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. Rebecca Torres had the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with powerful people who didn't want to cooperate with government investigations. Ms. Sterling, the Attorney General is concerned about the broader implications of what you've uncovered. If Hammond and Associates has been systematically stealing intellectual property from smaller firms, it represents a significant threat to business competition throughout Washington state. What does that mean in practical terms? It means the state is prepared to file its own lawsuit against Hammond and Associates for violations of antitrust laws and unfair business practices. We're also investigating whether they've violated state procurement regulations by using stolen information to win government contracts. Victoria felt a surge of vindication. Having the state government join their fight would provide resources and legitimacy that Hammond and Associates couldn't dismiss as easily as they had the coalition's efforts. What do you need from me? Testimony, documentation, and cooperation with our investigation. In return, we can provide legal support for your coalition and help defend against Hammond and Associates' countersuit. There's a condition, isn't there? Rebecca smiled for the first time since entering Victoria's office. You're perceptive. Yes, there's a condition. We need you to be the public face of this investigation. The Attorney General wants to hold press conferences, legislative hearings, and public forums about corporate accountability. You would be our primary witness and advocate. Victoria understood the implications immediately. Accepting the Attorney General's support would make her a public figure in ways that went far beyond the architectural community. She would become a symbol of small business fighting against corporate corruption, which would bring both opportunities and risks. Ms. Torres, I appreciate the state's interest in this case, but I need to ask, what happens if we're wrong? What if Hammond and Associates can somehow prove that they're innocent of the charges we're making? Based on the evidence we've reviewed, that seems highly unlikely. But even if some of the charges don't stick, the pattern of behavior is clear enough to justify significant regulatory action. And what happens to me personally if this becomes a political issue rather than a legal one? Rebecca's expression became more serious. I won't lie to you, Miss Sterling. Taking on this level of public visibility comes with risks. You'll be attacked by Hammond and Associates and their allies, your personal life will be scrutinized, and you'll be held accountable for every decision your coalition makes going forward. But you'll also have the resources and support of the state government, which means you won't be fighting alone anymore. And if we succeed, you'll have helped establish legal precedents that protect small businesses throughout Washington state. Victoria thought about the path that had brought her to this moment, from discovering Marcus's betrayal to leading a coalition of firms to potentially becoming the face of a statewide campaign for corporate accountability. Each step had required her to become someone stronger and more strategic than she had been before. I need 24 hours to consider this, she said. That evening, Victoria drove back to Whidbey Island to consult with Elizabeth Chen. The older woman listened to Victoria's description of the Attorney General's offer while they prepared dinner in her sustainable kitchen, solar panels powering the efficient appliances. This is what I was talking about when I said fighting changes you permanently, Elizabeth said as they sat down to eat. You're not just an architect anymore, you're becoming a public advocate for business ethics. That's a significant transformation. Do you think I should accept? That depends on what kind of life you want to build for yourself. If you want to return to being a boutique architect focused primarily on creative work, then accepting this offer might take you too far from that path. But if you've discovered that you enjoy strategic thinking and public leadership, then this could be the beginning of something much larger. Victoria considered Elizabeth's words as she looked out at the lights of Seattle across the dark water. I don't think I can go back to who I was before Marcus's betrayal. That person was too naive, too trusting, too focused on a narrow definition of success. Then the question becomes, what kind of leader do you want to be? Someone who fights individual battles as they arise, or someone who works to change the systems that allow those battles to happen in the first place? The next morning, Victoria called Rebecca Torres from the Attorney General's office. I'll do it, she said. I'll be your public advocate. But I have conditions. What kind of conditions? First, I want guarantees that Sterling and Associates will be protected from any retaliation that results from my public role. Second, I want input on the strategy and messaging for any public campaigns. And third, I want assurance that this investigation will be thorough enough to address not just Hammond and Associates, but the broader systemic issues that allowed their behavior to continue unchecked. Done. The Attorney General will be very pleased. Within a week, Victoria found herself standing at a podium in the Washington state capitol, flanked by the Attorney General and several other officials, announcing a comprehensive investigation into corporate espionage and anti-competitive practices in the Pacific Northwest business community. The evidence we have uncovered, Victoria told the assembled reporters, suggests that Hammond and Associates engaged in a systematic campaign to steal intellectual property from smaller firms, then used that stolen information to undercut their competitors and win contracts through fraudulent means. The questions from reporters were sharp and skeptical, reflecting the complexity of the legal and political issues involved. but Victoria found herself responding with confidence and precision, drawing on months of preparation and strategic thinking. "Ms. Sterling," asked a reporter from the Seattle Business Journal, "critics argue that your coalition is using the legal system to eliminate a successful competitor. How do you respond to charges that this is really about sour grapes rather than legitimate business ethics?" "The evidence speaks for itself," Victoria replied. "We have documentation showing systematic theft of intellectual property, financial records proving payments to corporate spies, and testimony from multiple victims. This isn't about eliminating competition, it's about ensuring that competition is fair and legal." As the press conference concluded, Victoria realized that she had crossed another threshold in her transformation. She was no longer just defending her own firm or even her coalition, she was advocating for a vision of business ethics that could reshape her entire industry. The woman who had discovered her fiancé's betrayal 6 months earlier would never have imagined herself in this position. But that woman no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood that true success came not from avoiding conflict, but from using conflict as a catalyst for positive change. The state investigation uncovered evidence that surpassed even Victoria's worst suspicions about Hammond and Associates' practices. Forensic accountants working for the Attorney General's office discovered a sophisticated network of shell companies, fake consulting contracts, and money laundering operations that had been funding corporate espionage activities for over 5 years. Victoria sat in the Attorney General's conference room, reviewing financial documents that showed the true scope of Hammond and Associates' criminal enterprise. The numbers were staggering: over $30 million in contracts won through stolen intellectual property, affecting more than 20 architectural firms throughout Washington and Oregon. "This goes far beyond what we originally imagined," said Rebecca Torres, spreading additional documents across the conference table. Hammond and Associates wasn't just stealing from competitors, they were operating a criminal organization designed to monopolize large-scale architectural contracts in the Pacific Northwest. Attorney General Patricia Williams, a formidable woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, had built her political career on taking down corporate corruption. She viewed the Hammond and Associates case as a perfect example of why aggressive business regulation was necessary. "Victoria," she said, "we're going to need you to testify before the state legislature's Business and Financial Services Committee. They're considering new legislation that would criminalize the kind of corporate espionage we've uncovered, and your experience provides the human face that lawmakers need to understand the impact of these crimes." Victoria had become comfortable with media appearances and legal proceedings, but testifying before the legislature felt like another level of public exposure entirely. Her words would potentially influence state law for decades to come. What kind of legislation are they considering? Enhanced penalties for theft of intellectual property, mandatory reporting requirements for companies that discover corporate espionage, and whistleblower protections for employees who report unethical practices, Rebecca explained. "Essentially, we're trying to create a legal framework that makes it much more difficult and risky for companies to engage in the kind of behavior Hammond and Associates normalized." "There's something else," Attorney General Williams added. "The FBI investigation has expanded to include similar practices in California and Oregon. Your case has become the catalyst for a multi-state investigation into corporate espionage in the architectural and engineering industries." Victoria felt the weight of responsibility that came with being at the center of such a significant legal and political battle. Her decision to fight Marcus's betrayal had inadvertently exposed a criminal conspiracy that affected hundreds of businesses and thousands of employees. "Attorney General Williams, I need to ask about the risks. Hammond and Associates and their legal team have been increasingly aggressive in their attacks on my credibility and my firm's business practices. What happens if they manage to discredit me publicly? That's why we need to be strategic about how we present your testimony and manage the media narrative," Williams replied. "Hammond and Associates is desperate, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. We're prepared to provide security for you and your key employees if necessary." The mention of security sent a chill through Victoria. She had been so focused on the legal and business aspects of the battle that she hadn't fully considered the potential for physical threats. Has there been specific intelligence suggesting threats against me or my team? Nothing concrete, Rebecca said, but we've learned that Patricia Hammond has hired a private investigation firm to research your background and personal relationships. They're looking for anything they can use to undermine your credibility or create personal pressure that might force you to withdraw from the case. Victoria thought about her team at Sterling and Associates, people who had supported her throughout the legal battle and deserved to be protected from any collateral damage. The idea that her fight for justice might put them at risk was deeply troubling. What kind of protection are we talking about? Increased security at your office building, monitoring of your electronic communications, and personal security details for key witnesses if the threat level escalates, Williams explained. We're treating this as a potential organized crime investigation, which means we take security threats very seriously. As Victoria left the Attorney General's office, she felt the familiar mix of determination and apprehension that had characterized her journey from betrayed fiancé to corporate whistleblower. Each revelation about Hammond and Associates' criminal activities reinforced her belief that fighting back had been the right decision, but it also raised the stakes in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Her next stop was a strategy meeting with the coalition of architectural firms, which had grown from the original 6 practices to 12 as more victims of Hammond and Associates came forward. They were meeting at Jonathan Pierce's firm, which had become the informal headquarters for coordinating their legal and media strategy. The good news, Jonathan reported to the assembled group, is that our civil lawsuits are looking increasingly strong as the criminal evidence emerges. The bad news is that Hammond and Associates is fighting back with everything they have. Maria Santos from Santos Architecture looked exhausted. They've contacted 3 of my largest clients, suggesting that working with firms involved in litigation creates unacceptable business risks. I've lost 2 major projects this month. Victoria felt a surge of anger at Hammond and Associates' continued attempts to punish their victims. That sounds like witness intimidation to me. Have you reported it to the FBI? I have, but the damage is already done. My firm can't survive much more of this kind of pressure. The room fell silent as the coalition members absorbed the implications of Maria's situation. They had all agreed to fight together, but the financial cost was mounting for some firms more than others. Robert Kim from Kim & Associates spoke up. We need to discuss something difficult. Some of us are in stronger financial positions to sustain this fight than others. If we're truly committed to this coalition, we may need to share resources more systematically. Victoria appreciated Robert's diplomatic phrasing, but the underlying issue was clear: some firms were struggling while others were actually benefiting from the publicity surrounding the case. I propose we create a mutual support fund, Victoria said. Sterling and Associates has received enough new business as a result of this case that we can contribute to help firms that are struggling. If we're going to fight as a coalition, we need to support each other financially as well as legally. The proposal sparked immediate discussion about logistics and fairness, but within an hour they had agreed on a framework that would help stabilize the most vulnerable firms while the legal battle continued. As the meeting concluded, Jonathan pulled Victoria aside. You've become quite a leader through all of this. Have you thought about what happens after the legal cases are resolved? What do you mean? I mean, you've developed political skills and public recognition that could take you in directions you might not have considered 6 months ago. The Attorney General's office isn't the only government agency that's been impressed by your work. Victoria realized that Jonathan was suggesting she consider a career in public service or policy work, roles that would have been unimaginable when she was focused primarily on architectural design. I'm still figuring out who I am after everything that's happened, she said. 6 months ago, my biggest concern was whether my building designs would win awards. Now I'm testifying before legislatures and appearing on national television. It's a lot to process. Just remember that leadership opportunities like this don't come along often. you have the chance to influence policy and business practices in ways that could benefit thousands of people. That's a rare gift. As Victoria drove back to Sterling and Associates that evening, she reflected on Jonathan's words. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed her personally and professionally had also revealed capabilities and interests she hadn't known she possessed. The question now was how to integrate those discoveries into a coherent vision for her future. The woman who had been devastated by Marcus's betrayal was gone, replaced by someone who understood that personal growth often came through confronting the worst experiences life could offer. The challenge now was deciding how to use that growth to build something meaningful and lasting. The legislative hearing took place on a crisp October morning in Olympia, with golden autumn light streaming through the tall windows of the Capitol building. Victoria sat at the witness table, facing a panel of state legislators whose questions would help determine whether Washington state would pass some of the most comprehensive corporate espionage legislation in the nation. Senator Catherine Morrison, the committee chair, was a former prosecutor who understood the complexities of white-collar crime. She had been following the Hammond and Associates case closely and had invited Victoria to testify as the lead witness in favor of the proposed legislation. Ms. Sterling, please tell the committee how corporate espionage has affected your business and the broader architectural community, Senator Morrison requested. Victoria had practiced this testimony dozens of times, but facing the legislators felt different from previous media appearances or legal proceedings. These people had the power to create laws that would protect future victims of corporate theft, making her words potentially more consequential than anything she had said before. Senator Morrison, members of the committee, 6 months ago I discovered that my business partner and fiancé had been systematically stealing intellectual property from my firm to benefit our primary competitor. What I initially thought was a personal betrayal has revealed itself to be part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that has affected dozens of businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest. Victoria walked the committee through the evidence that had emerged during the investigation, using charts and financial documents to illustrate the scope of Hammond and Associates' criminal activities. The legislators asked pointed questions about how the thefts had been conducted, how they had been discovered, and what existing laws had proven inadequate to address the crimes. The current legal framework, Victoria explained, treats intellectual property theft as a civil matter between businesses, which means that smaller firms often lack the resources to pursue justice. The proposed legislation would make corporate espionage a felony crime with serious penalties, giving prosecutors the tools they need to protect small businesses from this kind of predatory behavior. Representative David Chen, no relation to Marcus, raised his hand. Ms. Sterling, critics of this legislation argue that it could stifle legitimate employee mobility and business competition. How do you respond to those concerns? Victoria had anticipated this question, which reflected genuine concerns about balancing worker rights with business protection. Representative Chen, the legislation includes specific provisions that protect legitimate job changes and normal business competition. What it targets is the systematic theft of proprietary information for the purpose of undermining competitors. The evidence in our case shows clear intent to commit crimes, not normal business practices. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with Victoria answering questions about technical details, financial impacts, and policy implications. She found herself drawing on months of preparation and strategic thinking, presenting complex information in ways that lawmakers could understand and act upon. During a break, Rebecca Torres from the Attorney General's office approached her. "You're doing beautifully up there. The committee members are clearly impressed by your knowledge and composure." "It doesn't feel like enough," Victoria admitted. "The scope of what Hammond and Associates did is so vast that it's hard to convey the full impact in a single hearing. That's why we have the criminal trial coming up. The legislation is just the first step. The trial will provide a much more comprehensive public record of their crimes." When the hearing resumed, Victoria delivered her closing statement, which she had crafted to appeal to both the legal and emotional aspects of the legislators' decision-making process. Members of the committee, the question before you isn't just about punishing corporate criminals or protecting intellectual property rights. It's about what kind of business environment Washington state wants to foster. Do we want an economy where success comes from innovation, hard work, and fair competition? Or do we accept an environment where the largest companies can systematically steal from smaller ones without consequences? The businesses in my coalition represent hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in economic activity. But more importantly, they represent the entrepreneurial spirit that drives innovation and creates opportunities for working families. When criminal enterprises like Hammond and Associates are allowed to operate with impunity, they don't just harm their immediate victims, they undermine the basic fairness that makes capitalism work. I urge you to pass this legislation not just to protect businesses like mine, but to send a clear message that Washington state will not tolerate corporate crime, regardless of how sophisticated or well-funded the perpetrators might be. The committee voted unanimously to advance the legislation to the full legislature, with Senator Morrison praising Victoria's testimony as one of the most compelling presentations on corporate accountability we've heard in years. As Victoria left the Capitol building, she felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond winning a legal or political victory. She had successfully translated her personal experience into public policy, potentially protecting thousands of future victims of corporate espionage. Her phone buzzed with a call from David Reeves, her attorney. "Victoria, I have news about the criminal trial. The federal prosecutor has offered plea deals to Marcus and 2 other Hammond and Associates executives. They're willing to plead guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for testimony against Patricia Hammond and reduced prison sentences." Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. Marcus accepting a plea deal meant acknowledging his guilt, but it also meant he would serve less time in prison than if he were convicted at trial. What kind of sentences are we talking about? Marcus would serve 5 to 7 years in federal prison, plus significant financial restitution to all affected firms. The other executives would serve similar terms. And Patricia Hammond? She's refusing to accept any plea deal. She's going to trial and fighting all charges. If convicted, she's looking at 20 to 25 years in federal prison. Victoria considered the implications of Marcus's potential plea agreement. Seeing him testify against Patricia Hammond would provide closure in some ways, but it would also require her to face him in court for the first time since his betrayal. Do I have any input on whether to accept his plea deal? As a victim, you have the right to provide input to the prosecutor, but the final decision is theirs. They believe Marcus's testimony will be crucial to convicting Patricia Hammond on the most serious charges. I want to think about this before giving them my opinion. That evening, Victoria sat in her redesigned apartment, which she had transformed from the space she had shared with Marcus into a reflection of her new identity. The minimalist aesthetic emphasized clean lines and natural materials, creating an environment that felt both peaceful and purposeful. She poured herself a glass of wine and reviewed the timeline of events that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had discovered Marcus's betrayal 8 months earlier had been devastated by the loss of both her personal relationship and her business partnership. Now she was testifying before state legislatures, leading a coalition of firms in a landmark legal case, and potentially influencing federal corporate crime policy. The transformation had been painful but ultimately liberating. She had discovered capabilities and interests she never knew she possessed, and she had built relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than the naive trust that had made her vulnerable to betrayal. Her phone rang, showing Elizabeth Chen's number. "Victoria, I saw the news coverage of your legislative testimony. I wanted to tell you how proud I am of what you've accomplished." "Thank you, Elizabeth. I keep thinking about what you said regarding how fighting changes you permanently. You were right, I'm not the same person I was before this started. Do you regret that change?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "No, I don't. The person I was before was too trusting, too focused on a narrow definition of success. I've learned that strength comes from confronting difficult truths and fighting for what's right, even when it's costly. What will you do when the legal battles are over? I'm not sure yet. Sterling and Associates is thriving, but I've also discovered that I enjoy policy work and public advocacy. Maybe there's a way to combine architectural practice with broader efforts to improve business ethics and corporate accountability. That sounds like the beginning of a very interesting second act in your career. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Patricia Hammond had been arrested by FBI agents at her home, charged with racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, and multiple counts of theft of trade secrets. The indictment detailed a criminal enterprise that had generated over $50 million in fraudulent revenue over 5 years. Victoria read the news while sitting in her office, surrounded by the architectural drawings and models that represented her firm's legitimate accomplishments. The contrast between her honest work and Patricia Hammond's criminal enterprise felt stark and validating. Sarah Kim knocked on her door. "Victoria, there's a reporter from the Wall Street Journal on the phone. They want to interview you about the broader implications of the Hammond and Associates case for corporate accountability." Victoria accepted the interview, recognizing that her role as a public advocate was becoming as important as her work as an architect. The reporter asked sophisticated questions about business ethics, regulatory policy, and the challenges facing small businesses in competitive industries. "Ms. Sterling, you've become something of a symbol for small business owners fighting back against corporate crime. Do you see yourself continuing in that advocacy role after the legal cases are resolved? I think there's a need for voices that can translate the real-world impact of corporate crime into policy solutions. Too often, these issues are discussed in abstract terms that don't capture how they affect actual businesses and communities. If I can help bridge that gap, then yes, I'd like to continue that work." What advice would you give to other small business owners who might be facing similar challenges? Victoria thought about the lessons she had learned through months of legal battles and strategic thinking. Document everything, build strong relationships with other businesses in your industry, and don't be afraid to fight for what's right. The most important thing I learned is that you're not alone. There are always allies who share your values and will support you if you're willing to stand up for principles. After the interview, Victoria walked through Sterling and Associates offices, observing the busy activity of architects and designers working on projects that would shape communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her firm had grown to 25 employees, and they had moved into a larger space that reflected both their expanded capacity and their commitment to sustainable design. The Meridian Cultural Center was nearing completion, and early reviews suggested it would be considered one of the most innovative and beautiful buildings in Seattle's recent architectural history. Thomas Meridian had become not just a client but an advocate, recommending Sterling and Associates to other major developers and cultural institutions. But more importantly, Victoria had discovered that her greatest satisfaction came not from individual design achievements, but from the knowledge that her fight against Hammond and Associates had created lasting protections for other small businesses. The legislation she had helped pass was already being used to prosecute corporate espionage cases in other industries, and several other states were considering similar laws. As she stood in her office, looking out at Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond, Victoria felt a deep sense of purpose that went far beyond personal success. She had transformed her worst experience into something that would benefit thousands of people she would never meet. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed her had actually revealed her true strength and her most important calling. Sometimes, Victoria reflected, the worst things that happened to you were also the catalysts for becoming who you were meant to be. The federal trial of Patricia Hammond began on a cold February morning, nearly 1 year after Marcus had first revealed his betrayal to Victoria. The courthouse in downtown Seattle was packed with reporters, attorneys, and representatives from the architectural firms that had been victimized by Hammond and Associates' criminal enterprise. Victoria sat in the front row, flanked by other coalition members who had waited months to see justice served. She wore a navy blue suit that conveyed both professionalism and confidence, the uniform of someone who had transformed from victim to advocate over the course of a year-long battle. Federal prosecutor Michael Romano opened the government's case with a comprehensive overview of the evidence against Patricia Hammond and her co-conspirators. The prosecution's narrative was clear and compelling. Hammond and Associates had operated as a criminal organization designed to systematically steal intellectual property from smaller firms, then use that stolen information to win contracts through fraudulent means. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Romano said, over the next several weeks, you will hear testimony and see evidence that reveals one of the most sophisticated corporate espionage operations ever prosecuted in the Pacific Northwest. The defendants didn't simply engage in aggressive business practices, they committed federal crimes that undermined fair competition and caused millions of dollars in damages to legitimate businesses. The prosecution's first witness was Marcus Chen, who had agreed to testify against his former employer in exchange for a reduced sentence. Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions as Marcus walked to the witness stand, anger at his betrayal, sadness for the relationship they had lost, but also a grudging respect for his willingness to take responsibility for his crimes. Marcus looked thinner than Victoria remembered, and his usual confidence had been replaced by the demeanor of someone who understood the gravity of his situation. When he was sworn in, his voice was barely audible. Mr. Chen, Prosecutor Romano began, please tell the jury about your relationship with Sterling and Associates and Victoria Sterling. Marcus glanced briefly at Victoria before responding. I was a partner in Sterling and Associates and engaged to Victoria Sterling. We had worked together for 7 years, both professionally and personally. And how did your relationship with Hammond and Associates begin? Patricia Hammond approached me at an industry conference about 18 months ago. She suggested that a person with my skills and connections could be valuable to her firm. What did she ask you to do? Marcus took a deep breath before answering. Initially, she asked me to provide general information about Sterling and Associates' business practices and client relationships. She presented it as normal industry intelligence gathering. But it escalated beyond that, didn't it? Yes. Over time, she asked for specific project files, client communications, and proprietary design information. She made it clear that my compensation from Hammond and Associates depended on the quality and quantity of information I could provide. Victoria listened as Marcus detailed the systematic theft of her intellectual property, describing how he had copied files, photographed documents, and recorded conversations without her knowledge. Each revelation felt like a fresh betrayal, but she maintained her composure, knowing that his testimony was crucial to securing convictions. Mr. Chen, did you understand that what you were doing was illegal? Yes, I did. Patricia Hammond made it clear that what we were doing had to remain secret, and she provided specific instructions on how to avoid detection. I knew I was betraying Victoria's trust and violating my fiduciary duties to Sterling and Associates. Why did you continue? Marcus paused for a long moment, and Victoria saw a flicker of the man she had once loved. I told myself that I was just gathering information that would help me advance my career. But honestly, the money was significant, and Patricia Hammond convinced me that Sterling and Associates would never be able to compete with larger firms without this kind of intelligence sharing. Did you believe that justification? At the time, I wanted to believe it. Looking back, I realize I was just rationalizing criminal behavior because it benefited me financially. The cross-examination by Patricia Hammond's defense attorney was aggressive and thorough. The defense strategy was clear: portray Marcus as an unreliable witness who was lying to reduce his own sentence while shifting blame to others. Mr. Chen, isn't it true that you initiated contact with Hammond and Associates because you were dissatisfied with your role at Sterling and Associates? No, that's not accurate. Patricia Hammond approached me first. But you were unhappy with Ms. Sterling's leadership style, weren't you? You felt undervalued and underpaid? Victoria watched as Marcus struggled with the defense attorney's questions, which were designed to suggest that his betrayal was motivated by personal grievances rather than criminal conspiracy. "I had some concerns about business decisions, but that doesn't justify what I did. I committed crimes, and I take full responsibility for those actions." The defense attorney pressed harder. "Isn't it true, Mr. Chen, that you're testifying against Ms. Hammond because the prosecutor promised you a lenient sentence? That your testimony is essentially bought and paid for?" "I'm testifying because what we did was wrong, and Patricia Hammond was the architect of the entire operation. She deserves to be held accountable for the crimes she organized and directed." As Marcus's testimony concluded, Victoria felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Seeing him take responsibility for his actions and face the consequences of his choices provided validation that justice was being served, even if it couldn't undo the personal and professional damage he had caused. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from FBI agents, forensic accountants, and representatives from the victimized architectural firms. Each witness added another layer of evidence demonstrating the scope and sophistication of Hammond and Associates' criminal enterprise. Victoria's own testimony came during the second week of the trial. She had prepared extensively with the prosecution team, but walking to the witness stand still felt like one of the most important moments of her professional life. "Ms. Sterling," Prosecutor Romano began, "please tell the jury how you discovered that your intellectual property was being stolen." Victoria described the morning when Marcus had revealed his betrayal, the subsequent investigation that uncovered the scope of the conspiracy, and the impact on Sterling and Associates and the broader architectural community. "The theft of our intellectual property wasn't just a business crime," Victoria testified. "It represented a fundamental violation of the trust and collaboration that makes professional relationships possible. When clients work with architects, they're sharing their dreams and visions for projects that will serve their communities for generations. Patricia Hammond turned that trust into a tool for criminal profit." The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on Victoria's motivations for pursuing the case and the benefits her firm had received from the media attention surrounding the legal battles. "Ms. Sterling, isn't it true that Sterling and Associates has actually benefited significantly from the publicity surrounding this case? That you've gained new clients and industry recognition as a result of your legal battles?" Victoria had anticipated this line of questioning. "Our firm has grown, but that growth came as a result of hard work and ethical business practices, not from being victimized by criminal conspiracy. The success we've achieved is despite the crimes committed against us, not because of them." "But you've become something of a celebrity in your industry, haven't you? Speaking at conferences, testifying before legislatures, appearing on television?" "I've accepted those responsibilities because I believe there's value in speaking out about corporate accountability and business ethics. But I would gladly trade all of that recognition to have never been victimized by this criminal enterprise in the first place." As Victoria concluded her testimony, she felt proud of how she had presented both the facts of the case and the broader principles at stake. The jury seemed engaged and sympathetic, but she knew that Patricia Hammond's defense team would present their own version of events that might complicate the narrative. The defense case focused primarily on arguing that Hammond and Associates had engaged in aggressive but legal business practices, and that any criminal behavior was the result of rogue employees acting without corporate authorization. Patricia Hammond herself took the stand, presenting herself as a successful businesswoman who had built her firm through hard work and legitimate competition. "I never authorized or encouraged any illegal activities," Hammond testified. "If employees of my firm violated laws or ethical standards, they did so without my knowledge or approval." But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. Financial records showed that Hammond had personally approved payments to Marcus and other corporate spies, and recorded conversations revealed her discussing specific strategies for stealing intellectual property from competitors. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all major charges. Patricia Hammond was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, and theft of trade secrets, facing a sentence of 20 to 25 years in federal prison. As the verdicts were read, Victoria felt a profound sense of vindication and relief. The woman who had nearly destroyed her life and threatened the integrity of an entire industry would face serious consequences for her crimes. Outside the courthouse, Victoria addressed the media gathered to cover the verdict. Today's convictions send a clear message that corporate crime has consequences, regardless of how sophisticated or well-funded the perpetrators might be, she said. But more importantly, these verdicts validate the courage of small business owners who are willing to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. The past year has been the most challenging period of my professional life, but it has also been the most meaningful. We've proven that justice is possible when victims work together and refuse to be intimidated by powerful interests. As Victoria walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by the colleagues and allies who had supported her throughout the legal battle, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had brought her to this moment. A year earlier, she had been devastated by betrayal and facing the potential destruction of everything she had built. Now she was recognized as a leading advocate for business ethics and corporate accountability, with a thriving firm and a new sense of purpose that extended far beyond architectural design. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed her had actually revealed her greatest strengths and most important calling. Sometimes, Victoria realized, the worst experiences in life were also the foundations for building something better than you had ever imagined. 6 months after Patricia Hammond's conviction, Victoria stood on the observation deck of the newly completed Meridian Cultural Center, watching the sunset paint Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. The building had exceeded every expectation, earning recognition from architectural publications worldwide and attracting visitors from across the country who came to experience its innovative blend of sustainability and artistic vision. The cultural center had become a symbol not just of architectural excellence, but of the triumph of ethical business practices over corporate crime. Thomas Meridian had insisted on including a plaque in the lobby that honored the integrity and courage of Sterling and Associates in the face of unprecedented challenges. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," said a voice behind her. Victoria turned to find Rebecca Torres from the Attorney General's office, accompanied by a woman Victoria didn't recognize. "Rebecca, what brings you to the Cultural Center?" "I wanted you to meet Senator Elizabeth Warren," Rebecca said, gesturing to her companion. "She's been following your case and the broader implications for small business protection and corporate accountability." Victoria felt a moment of surprise. Senator Warren was a national figure known for her advocacy on behalf of small businesses and consumer protection, but Victoria hadn't expected her interest to extend to the Pacific Northwest architectural industry. "Ms. Sterling, I've been impressed by the way you've transformed a personal betrayal into systematic reform," Senator Warren said. "The legislation you helped pass in Washington state is being considered as a model for federal corporate espionage laws." "I appreciate that recognition, Senator. But honestly, I was just trying to protect my firm and seek justice for what happened to us." "That's exactly why your advocacy has been so effective. You understand the real-world impact of these policies because you've lived through the consequences of inadequate protection for small businesses." Senator Warren explained that she was working on federal legislation that would strengthen penalties for corporate espionage and provide better resources for small businesses facing intellectual property theft. She was interested in Victoria's insights on how federal policy could address the systemic issues that had allowed Hammond and Associates to operate for so long without detection. "The challenge," Victoria said, "is that many small business owners don't have the resources or knowledge to recognize when they're being targeted by sophisticated corporate espionage operations. By the time they realize what's happening, significant damage has already been done." "What would have made a difference in your case?" "Better reporting requirements for companies that discover data breaches or suspicious employee behavior. More resources for federal agencies to investigate these crimes proactively. And stronger whistleblower protections for employees who witness unethical practices." As they continued their conversation, Victoria realized that her role as an advocate was evolving beyond the specific circumstances of her own case. She was becoming a recognized voice on issues of business ethics and corporate accountability, with opportunities to influence policy at the national level. "Senator Warren, can I ask you something? I'm an architect who accidentally became an advocate for business reform. Do I have the credibility to be effective in policy discussions at the federal level?" Senator Warren smiled. "Ms. Sterling, some of the most effective advocates are people who never intended to become advocates. You have something that career politicians and policy experts often lack: authentic experience with the problems you're trying to solve." After the senator left, Victoria remained on the observation deck, thinking about the unexpected direction her career had taken. Sterling and Associates was thriving, with 35 employees and projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. She had achieved the professional success she had always wanted, but she had also discovered interests and capabilities that went far beyond architectural design. Her phone buzzed with a call from Jonathan Pierce. "Victoria, I have a proposition for you. Several of us have been discussing the possibility of creating a formal organization to advocate for ethical business practices in the architectural industry. We'd like you to consider serving as the founding director." The proposal intrigued Victoria. An advocacy organization would allow her to continue her policy work while maintaining her architectural practice, creating a formal structure for the kind of reform efforts she had been pursuing informally. What would this organization do? Develop industry standards for ethical business practices, provide resources for firms facing corporate espionage or other predatory behaviors, and advocate for regulatory changes that protect architectural firms from the kind of crimes we experienced. "Jonathan, I'm interested, but I need to think about how this would affect Sterling and Associates and my other commitments." "Of course. But Victoria, you've become the most recognized advocate for business ethics in our industry. If we're going to create lasting change, we need someone with your credibility and experience to lead the effort." That evening, Victoria had dinner with Elizabeth Chen at her mentor's home on Whidbey Island. They sat on the deck overlooking Puget Sound, watching ferries move steadily across the darkening water. "You've reached a decision point," Elizabeth observed, noting Victoria's contemplative mood. "I'm being offered opportunities that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. But I'm not sure how to balance them with the architectural practice I've spent years building." "What does success look like to you now?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "It's more complex than it used to be. I still love designing buildings and creating spaces that enhance people's lives. But I've also discovered that I'm passionate about fighting for systemic change, about creating protections for small businesses and ethical standards for our industry. Those aren't necessarily conflicting goals." "No, but they require different kinds of time and attention. I'm trying to figure out how to honor both aspects of what I've become." Elizabeth refilled their wine glasses and leaned back in her chair. "Victoria, when I was your age, I thought I had to choose between being an architect and being an advocate for women in the profession. I spent years trying to compartmentalize those roles, thinking they were separate identities. But eventually, I realized that my advocacy work and my architectural practice reinforced each other. Being an advocate made me a better architect because it forced me to think about the broader context of our work. And being a practicing architect gave me credibility as an advocate because I understood the real-world challenges of the profession." "You're suggesting I can do both?" "I'm suggesting that maybe you've already been doing both, and now it's time to formalize that integration rather than treating them as competing priorities." The next morning, Victoria called Jonathan Pierce to accept his offer to lead the new advocacy organization. But she also proposed expanding its scope beyond just the architectural industry to address corporate accountability issues affecting all small businesses. "We learned that Hammond and Associates practices weren't unique to architecture," Victoria explained. "Similar forms of corporate espionage and predatory behavior are affecting small businesses in many industries. If we're going to create lasting change, we need to think bigger than just our own profession. Jonathan was enthusiastic about the expanded vision. What would you call this organization? Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from discovering betrayal to building alliances to winning justice to creating systemic reform. The Alliance for Ethical Business Practices, she said. It reflects both our collaborative approach and our commitment to principled behavior in all business relationships. 6 months later, Victoria stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing the first national conference of the Alliance for Ethical Business Practices. The audience included small business owners, policy experts, attorneys, and legislators from across the country who had come to discuss strategies for combating corporate crime and promoting ethical business practices. 2 years ago, I discovered that my business partner and fiancé had been systematically stealing intellectual property from our firm, Victoria told the audience. That betrayal nearly destroyed both my business and my faith in professional relationships. But over the past 2 years, I've learned that individual betrayals are often symptoms of larger systemic problems. The crimes committed against Sterling and Associates were possible because our legal and regulatory systems didn't provide adequate protection for small businesses facing sophisticated corporate predators. Today, we're here to change that. Not by seeking revenge against those who wronged us, but by building better systems that protect future victims and promote the kind of ethical behavior that makes business relationships trustworthy and productive. Victoria looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected the diversity of American small business, entrepreneurs from different industries, backgrounds, and regions who shared a commitment to building something better. The Alliance for Ethical Business Practices represents a new approach to corporate accountability, one that's led by the people who actually experience these problems rather than by politicians or policy experts who study them from a distance. We've already helped pass stronger corporate espionage laws in 12 states, provided legal support to over 200 small businesses facing predatory behavior, and created industry standards that are being adopted by professional organizations nationwide. But our work is just beginning. Every person in this audience has the power to influence business practices in their own communities and industries. Together, we can create an economy where success comes from innovation and hard work rather than from stealing from competitors or exploiting regulatory gaps. As the conference concluded, Victoria felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the path her life had taken. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed her had actually revealed her most important calling, using her experience and skills to create protections for others facing similar challenges. Sterling and Associates continued to thrive, now with offices in Seattle and Portland and projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. The Meridian Cultural Center had won numerous awards and established Victoria's reputation as one of the region's premier architects. But her greatest pride came from the Alliance for Ethical Business Practices, which had grown into a national organization with chapters in 25 states and partnerships with government agencies, professional associations, and advocacy groups working on related issues. 3 years after Marcus's betrayal, Victoria had built a life that was richer, more purposeful, and more meaningful than anything she had imagined before her world was shaken apart. The woman who had been devastated by betrayal had become a leader who understood that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from transforming difficult experiences into forces for positive change. 5 years after the Hammond and Associates trial, Victoria Sterling stood in her new office overlooking Elliott Bay, where ferries continued their steady passage between Seattle and the surrounding islands. At 39, she had built something unprecedented, a hybrid career that combined architectural practice with national advocacy for business ethics and corporate accountability. The view from her office encompassed several buildings she had designed, including the award-winning Meridian Cultural Center and the recently completed Pacific Northwest Sustainability Institute, a research facility that pushed the boundaries of green architecture. But the plaques and awards covering her office walls told only part of the story. The Alliance for Ethical Business Practices had grown into a powerful national organization with 50,000 members and an annual budget of $12 million. The alliance had helped pass federal legislation strengthening corporate espionage penalties, provided legal support to over 1,500 small businesses, and created certification programs for ethical business practices that were now required for many government contracts. Victoria's phone rang, interrupting her reflection. "Ms. Sterling? This is Sarah Martinez from the Department of Justice. I'm calling to inform you that Marcus Chen has been released from federal prison after serving 4 years of his sentence." Victoria felt a familiar knot in her stomach. She had known this day would come, but hearing about Marcus's release still triggered complex emotions about their shared past and his betrayal. "Thank you for letting me know. Has he attempted any contact with Sterling and Associates or any members of our team?" "No, and his parole conditions specifically prohibit him from contacting you or your business. He's also banned from working in the architectural industry for 5 years as part of his sentence." After hanging up, Victoria walked to her window and looked out at the city that had shaped her transformation from betrayed partner to national advocate. Seattle had changed significantly in the past 5 years, with new buildings reshaping the skyline and a booming tech industry attracting people from around the world. But the fundamental character of the city remained constant, a place where innovation and environmental consciousness combined to create something unique and meaningful. Victoria felt proud to have contributed to that character through both her architectural work and her advocacy for ethical business practices. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Victoria, you have visitors." Thomas Meridian entered, followed by 3 people Victoria didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s wearing an expensive suit, and 2 younger men with the earnest demeanor of recent graduates. "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Senator Janet Collins from Oregon, and these are James and Michael, 2 recent architecture graduates who are interested in joining firms that prioritize ethical business practices." Senator Collins stepped forward with a warm smile. "Ms. Sterling, I've been following your work with great interest. I'm chairing the Senate Subcommittee on Small Business Protection, and we're developing new legislation based on the model you've created with the Alliance for Ethical Business Practices. I'm honored by your interest, Senator. How can I help?" "We're looking for someone to serve as a special advisor on small business protection and corporate accountability. The position would involve working with federal agencies to develop better enforcement mechanisms and providing guidance on policy development." Victoria felt the familiar pull of expanding responsibility and influence. Federal advisory positions had the potential to create policy changes that could benefit millions of small businesses across the country. What would this involve in practical terms? Approximately 1 week per month in Washington, plus participation in policy development committees and congressional hearings. You would maintain your architectural practice and advocacy work, but you'd also have direct input on federal policy. The offer represented another significant expansion of Victoria's role as a national voice on business ethics and corporate accountability. But it also meant taking on responsibilities that would require careful balance with her existing commitments. "Senator Collins, I'm very interested, but I need to discuss this with my team at Sterling and Associates and the Alliance Board before making a commitment." After the visitors left, Victoria sat with Sarah Kim and Elena Vasquez, her longtime colleagues who had become partners in Sterling and Associates as the firm had grown and evolved. "This federal position could provide incredible opportunities to influence policy," Sarah said, "but it would also require significant travel and time away from the firm." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "We've built strong systems and leadership depth over the past 5 years. Sterling and Associates can function effectively even when you're focused on other responsibilities. The question," Victoria said, "is whether taking on federal advisory role serves our larger mission or just feeds my own ego about influencing policy at the highest levels." "Why can't it be both?" Sarah asked with a smile. "You've never shied away from ambitious goals when you believed they would create positive change. That evening, Victoria drove to her new home in the hills above Seattle, a house she had designed for herself that embodied everything she had learned about sustainable architecture and personal sanctuary. The structure seemed to float among the trees, with walls of glass that brought the forest inside while solar panels and geothermal systems made it carbon neutral. She opened a bottle of wine from a Washington state vineyard and sat on her deck, watching the lights of Seattle come alive in the valley below. The city looked different from this elevated perspective, more integrated with its natural environment, more harmonious in its blend of urban energy and Pacific Northwest beauty. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Victoria, this is Marcus. I know I'm not supposed to contact you, but I wanted to say that I'm sorry for what I did and proud of what you've accomplished. You became the person I always knew you could be. I hope someday you can forgive me." Victoria stared at the message for a long time, feeling the complex emotions that Marcus still triggered. The man who had nearly destroyed her life was asking for forgiveness, acknowledging her success, and expressing pride in her accomplishments. She deleted the message without responding. Some relationships, once broken by fundamental betrayal, couldn't be repaired through apologies or expressions of regret. But she realized that her anger toward Marcus had faded into something more like sadness for what they had both lost and the different paths their lives had taken. The next morning, Victoria called Senator Collins to accept the federal advisory position. The decision felt natural, another step in the evolution that had transformed her from a talented but naive architect into a national leader on business ethics and corporate accountability. "Senator Collins, I'm honored to accept your offer. I believe there's important work to be done at the federal level, and I'm ready to contribute to that effort." As she hung up the phone, Victoria reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years earlier, she had been a successful architect with a growing firm and plans for a conventional life with her business partner and fiancé. The betrayal that had shattered those plans had also revealed capabilities and purposes she never could have discovered otherwise. She had become a leader who understood that true success came not from avoiding conflict, but from transforming challenges into opportunities for growth and positive change. Sterling and Associates had grown into one of the Pacific Northwest's most respected architectural firms, known for both innovative design and ethical business practices. The Alliance for Ethical Business Practices had become a national force for corporate accountability and small business protection. And now Victoria was positioned to influence federal policy in ways that could benefit millions of entrepreneurs and small business owners across the country. The woman who had been devastated by betrayal had built something far more meaningful and lasting than anything she had lost. She had created a legacy that combined professional excellence with principled leadership, demonstrating that personal integrity and business success were not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing. As Victoria looked out at Elliott Bay, where ferries continued their reliable passage between the mainland and the islands, she felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place. The worst experience of her life had become the foundation for the most meaningful work of her career. Sometimes, Victoria reflected, the most devastating betrayals were also the catalysts for discovering who you were truly meant to become. The architecture of betrayal had been painful to experience, but rebuilding from that destruction had created something more beautiful and enduring than anything she could have imagined. The sun rose over the Cascade Mountains, casting golden light across the water and the city that had shaped her transformation. Victoria Sterling, architect and advocate, was ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead.